first I'd like to thank the Walton family. As I said every time, they make this opportunity possible. So thank you so much for them, their support. And also, anybody that wants to get AI credits, the link is here. And if you are in Zoom, you can find my email at the School of Architecture website. Send me an email, and with your AI number, I'll take care of it. So thank you for that. As always, we're going to have the Q&A at the end, and until spring, when James will be more nicer than I am, he will offer, I think, receptions, I think. Are you?
I don't know, but you're not invited.
Are you going to start receptions? Yeah. Well, we don't do reception because it's complicated with, of course, COVID-19. But all right. So the talk tonight closes, as I said, our fall 2021 lecture series. It started with Jane Edmonds and followed by our Walton critic, Trey Trahan, and landscape architect, John Hoyt. The goal has been to advance our understanding of the relationships between justice and architecture, and in so doing, invite us to consider the ethical function of architecture. The issue of ethics requires particular currency in our days, where issues of social, economic, environmental, and racial justice have become increasingly visible and therefore unavoidable to address. But what does it mean to pursue justice in architecture? How do the various spatial and social cultural dimensions of the built environment contribute to healing, compassion, and equity? Is empathy important? Can architecture foster peacemaking? Where do you stand ethically in front of today's challenges, and what are you going to do about it? How does spirituality enter your architectural practice? What does racial, economic, environmental, and social justice look architecturally? What does it mean to ethically profess architecture today? In tonight's lecture, entitled Specialized Psychologies of Inequity, April de Simone will provide many pointers at how this question could be considered and perhaps responded to. So let me introduce April de Simone. I'm very happy to have you here today. First, it just happened a few weeks ago. April took a new position as a principal in Trahan Architects in New York City. You all met Trey Trahan when he was here, and he will be back in December. This was not known when we actually hired you to come here, so congratulations, April. As a transdisciplinary designer, she brings 20 years of experience navigating the intersectionality of architecture, planning, and systems thinking. April's work, inspired by her experiences growing up in the Bronx, New York, cultivates reframed opportunities within pedagogy and processes, advancing opportunities within the practice of architecture to specialize healing, equity, and restitution. In 2015, April co-founded Designing the We, where she launched the co-curated exhibition and platform, And Design the Red Line, which explores the historical and contemporary spatial reverberations of unjust policies and practices like residential racial ordinances, redlining, and urban renewal. Her interdisciplinary work investigated the implicit and invisible relationship between architecture and the human condition, connecting a deeper understanding of how inequity, supremacy in its various forms, and dehumanization become specialized and proliferated. This body of work has been infused in numerous projects demonstrating the equitable, humane, and just capacity of architecture and design mediums, including a supervised visitation site at the Bronx Borough Family Courthouse and the social enterprise venture Urban Stars. April continued to be an invited lecturer, speaker, and facilitator at numerous institutions. She sits on progressive boards, including the American Sustainable Business Council, and works closely on a local and national levels with diverse stakeholders within the design sectors, like the Urban Design Forum, on issues of race, equity, and democratic architecture. So let's welcome April to the podium.
Thank you, Julio. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? We needed that juncture of the little alligator wiggling in. I told Julio, whoever starts a lecture on November 1st, I'm a mom, and I spent miles walking yesterday doing trick-or-treating and going to different events. So it was a nice humor point to bring in to make it all come to light. I appreciate being here, and I extend warm welcomes and thank yous to the students of your studio for such an engaging conversation today, and all the work that went into creating the Walton series, and my colleagues who presented before me. Oh. Yeah, let's get it rolling. How do I? It should be one back. Yeah. There we go. As Julio introduced, as he opened up this lecture series, what is the agency of spatial practice? What is our agency as planners, as architects? I don't think it's just a question of architecture and planning, but I imbue upon all the audiences I speak to, what is the agency as a spatial practitioner? Because every decision that is made, whether you are an architect or whether you are a philanthropic donor, has an influence in the built environment. And this has heavily influenced my work. And it's been, of course, more than 20 years. So before we can go to the advent of what 2020 has shown us, between COVID and the racial uprising around the death of George Floyd, and understanding what is the agency or how do we spatialize concepts of equity, healing, and inclusion, we need to understand how we have arrived to the incidents of George Floyd, to the incidents of who is most impacted by COVID and beyond. So in order for us to understand what we can do, we have to understand where we have come from. This is often a devoid place of conversation, particularly within academic institutions, particularly within the field of architecture. And as my agency, as a spatial practitioner, I think it's very important for us to start. It's hard to imagine, but not too long ago, I share these slides. This is my personal experience. This is my green space. This is my neighborhood. Coming from the Bronx, New York, very, very early on as a child, I tried to understand, how is it that this is okay? How is this normal, watching my mother get up every single day to work and provide for her family and come home to environments that end up looking like this? We heard Jimmy Carter, when he visited this area, say it looked like a bomb went off, or it looked like World War II. How do we begin to humanize what does this mean for those of us who didn't have the option to just pack up and go? What did it mean, and what did the architecture speak to each of us who had to navigate with our identity and with who we were through these streets? How did we get to these positions of total destruction? What has happened? What was the thinking that went behind this? How was this reinforced by, again, these spatialized psychologies of inequity? It really inspired very early on to understand, what did we mean by systems of the built environment? What does the built environment mean? When we look at neighborhoods or we look at communities and we start thinking about education or housing or commerce or in any infrastructure, how do we get to the point where what you saw, and we continue to see in many neighborhoods across the United States, how do we get to this point? Who influences the systems of the built environment? How are people, and how do we access these points within housing? Who are the decision makers? That it isn't just about making a blueprint or creating a space that says, oh, now it's green and we can have people play. No, how do we even access that? How do we reinforce these pariah zones? And how do influencers, again, not just us as architects or planners or in the space of spatial practice come up with these types of systems or enforce or impose systems that again reinforce what we call a hierarchy of human value. And it was within this interrogation and investigation that I began to wonder, at the root of systems change are three components: perceptions and mental models. And how do those perceptions and mental models become spatialized and reinforce power, dynamics, connections, and networks? And how do the interplay of those two create the policies, practices, and investments that yield those very first slides that I showed you? And yield that even after we clear and we build on top of them, that the same inequities are embodied and indicted within the systems that we build upon. How did we get there? What does that mean? When I say perceptions and mental models, it's when we look at a deeper history, beginning with enslavement or beyond, and what happened to First Nations people, we begin to understand that there is a psychology, a mental model, again, that's others, and accepts or doesn't accept difference. It determines through moral environmentalism and all of these movements. How many of us here are familiar with the practice of scientific racism or eugenics? How many of us here understood that many of those who were considered progressives and the liberal reformers of the earliest 20th century were those that really embodied this concept of using science and in the space of academia to reinforce these concepts of who was considered human and who was considered subhuman? And those very people were the ones that went on to set up our institutions, become the experts of the fourth arm of government that is not voted in by the people. And those perceptions and mental models began to build relationships and connections and power dynamics. And again, it's easier for us today to point a finger and say, because if you feel a certain way or express this, that you are this person or you're a racist. That's simple language. I see the most liberal and progressive people sit at a table with me and invoke the same psychology of othering, particularly when they speak of low, quote unquote, low income communities versus luxury housing. They reinforce the very paradigms that we say we want to break. And those relationships, connections, and power dynamics are really rooted, particularly after we see Jim Crow and other forces of scientific racism rise in this country. And what did that mean? It meant that if you even tried to educate yourself or access those systems that I mentioned in the built environment, you were met violently with oppression or with your life. And if this is the history we're coming from, how did it translate to these policies, practices, and investments? So how did occupational ideology become infused into the very things that reinforce spatial dynamics? So when I speak of spatialized psychologies of inequity, it is coming from this history of perceptions, of power, of policies and practices and investments that have found their way into the infrastructure of not only America, but a global narrative of, again, how we address basic human needs in people. In order to address many of these issues within the built environment, we've created a framework. If we need to shift perceptions, policies, practices, and investments, what is the framework that allows us to do that? It led me to understand that we don't have the right tools. Pedagogy in our classrooms do not teach us this history, especially in design. We move right into the intervention. We move right into the aesthetic or the materiality. But we don't understand the why of why we have arrived to the point of an intervention, particularly when we're addressing systemic inequity and justice and healing. And if pedagogy is an opportunity, how can reframed pedagogies leads us into different processes on how we evaluate site or space and understand the dynamic that history doesn't start at the point where we create an intervention. That is, there is a deeper, insidious history that we need to address in our work. And how do we become these agents of social justice and change? And if we had the right pedagogy and we had the right processes, how does that translate again into spatial practice? So again, when we see this overview and we think about, well, what does this all connect to today? Well, what does become spatialized? If you have people thinking a certain way, How does it start the way it starts? With pedagogy, one example, as Julio shared, was the launching of the Undesign the Red Line exhibition in 2015. Again, I found that no matter who sat across from me, and people who were making major decisions for the built environment, they were not aware of this deeper history. So we named it Undesign the Red Line, and we went on a road show. And the goal was to build a community conversation around, again, how we can use tools that not just necessarily happen within the academic space, but begin to be infused into the built environment in a very different way. And the exhibition now has traveled across the country in many of the states and soon to be international. But it really was about invoking how do we undesign these mental models and these perceptions that we draw red lines around our mind of who's valuable and who isn't. We have a 16-foot timeline that is at the center of this whole exhibition that curates an understanding. It's a play on redlining. How many of you here know about the New Deal redlining maps that were created in the 1930s? So we see the maps, but do we ever interrogate who sat at the table and made them? The maps aren't the advent of racial segregation practices or the dehumanizing factors. The maps, again, just reflect the thinking of those who were in positions of authority. And of course, we study systems of inequity. We studied in this timeline, Great Depression, moral environmentalism. And it leads us into this place of, again, how do we get to a point where there is this hierarchy of human value? If you know that Dalton goes to England and comes, and Davenport is a chicken breeder who's in the middle here, he brings this ideology of using science to then change and use physicality and people's appearance to again say there is something of supreme worthiness and everything else is not. And you can see on the lower left-hand side, that's Uncle Sam in the 1920s being consumed by this anti-immigration fear. And at this time, Irish and Asians are not assimilated into this culture of whiteness. They are considered threats to the purity of America. And people like Madison Grant, who is a mentor to a future president, Teddy Roosevelt, is celebrated as a great conservationist, one of the founders of the Sierra Club, writes a book, The Passing of the Great Race. And in this book, he speaks about how we need to stop immigration from coming in. It's kind of ironic that history repeats itself. It's the same conversation we're having today of what we don't want to allow in a space. His book was so successful and so impactful that he received a thank you letter from Hitler for his language that he wrote in here around purity. When we think of who adopts this language, we see how then it becomes the propaganda to get spatialized. In this photo, you see two dots. The first dot north of Washington is the first Black family moves in to a white neighborhood. And one of the neighbors, Mr. Deichel, states that it's an uproar. And how this perception translates into power is that Mr. Deichel convinces Mayor Mahul of Baltimore in 1910 to write one of the first residential racial ordinances in this country. And it basically was a precursor to redlining maps of where or who or what can live anywhere in the built environment. What you see on the bottom is that Mr. Deichel created a footprint through this racial residential ordinance and convinced the mayor to pass it. But he is long gone, and now the site of where his home is public housing. So it branded an area, and it created what we saw in slum clearance and urban renewal to further uphold that integrated spaces are pariahs, worthy of doing the things that we're doing, of building for the less than or unfortunate. And then we see how this translates into people like Homer Hoyt. Homer Hoyt is educated under this academia that is gripped by scientific racism and eugenics. And he writes the dissertation of 100 years of land value. And you can all see for yourself as a PhD student at the University of Chicago, the 10 nationalities he thinks are detrimental to land. And he sets this precedent. And what's more alarming is that he also writes the sector theory of planning. And he embodes this imprint on the built environment. What's more egregious is that Homer Hoyt becomes the chief economist of the Federal Housing Administration under the New Deal. This is, again, a redlining map. 239 of these are created with people like Homer Hoyt in positions of authority. And it's not that, again, the indictment is, oh, we have a racist that is doing this. No. The indictment is that people who are put in positions of authority to steward the ideologies and principles that I think all of us here purport we believe in, of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, are making decisions that impact us all and continue to impact us all. So we can't, the egregious part is, it's not all men are created equal. It's not we the people. And this becomes spatialized. Because green on this map, for those of you who don't know, are ideal for investment. Blue is followed by green, then yellow, then red. Red is the most egregious, where we will never develop or invest in. And of course, who do you think lived in the red areas? People who were considered undesirable by Mr. Hoyt. Why is this significant? It's hard to see here, but question C asks, what is a detrimental influence, for the scholars that like to debate that race wasn't an issue? Well, you see C here says a detrimental influence is what? Negro and Puerto Rican. So the federal government takes it a step further. Now we don't need redlining maps. Now we just put into the federal underwriting manual language that says we are not going to support areas that create integration, right? Why is this important? Well, the New Deal is one of the greatest social policies, right? It stopped the spin-worthy of the Great Depression of 1929. Prior to the market crash of 1929, in order to buy a home, you had to put 30 to 50% down, and you had 5 to 7 years to pay. Well, with the New Deal and FHA, we created the Suburbanization of America. I recommend that you all read Crabgrass Frontier by Kenneth Jackson. And in there, it creates essentially what we know as the American middle class. And if my family was able to buy a home at this time, I would build something called intergenerational wealth, that I get to pay tuition for my kids to go to college and do a lot of other great things. But when you carve out a whole segment of society from being able to buy it, and you restrict them from being able to come in, then who has access to this concept of intergenerational wealth? How do we create the hyper-segregated footprint of America? Who benefited from those 15 to 30-year mortgages with no money down with the GI Bill? So when we look across the landscape and space, and we say, well, how does it get this way? This is sort of what's embedded into our systems. And anyone who tried to fight this, because it wasn't only that you couldn't get a loan to move into the new suburbs of America, but if you even were able to get a loan and you moved in, you were violently removed. And this becomes a field day, a practice that everyone eats from, including architects who begin to design those homes in suburbia, who don't think twice about the restrictive deeds where people like my mom could never move into those areas. And if you read this is a quote from a textbook teaching realtors how to steer communities. The colored people certainly have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but they must recognize the economic disturbance which their presence in a white neighborhood causes, and forgo their desire to split off from the established district where the rest of their race lives. And this fuels not just the banking industry or the insurance industry. This fuels, again, the automobile industry, the rubber industry. Everyone is getting paid off of this. And so as we pass through all these systems and we get to this hyper-segregation where redlined areas begin to deteriorate, and again become the proof of what spatialized psychologies of inequity look like. We see that the advent of, as these places are losing deindustrialization, capital is moving and white flight is occurring, we see that the stigmatization, that perception and mental model by people in power continue to enforce policies, practices, and investments that yield what you're reading on this screen. That people in these communities are the problem and the pariah, that we need to bring them to heel, that we need to create new policies to control. When we think of trauma-induced environments that we're talking about today, you can't address trauma-induced and design for trauma-induced environments if you're not aware of this history. And we see today investment returns. This is a picture of Baltimore. And even though we are putting money into places like Baltimore, we're in the midst of the second redlining. Because through sheer economics, once we do an investment in an area, can people be able to come back and live in them? No. This is a picture of how, again, in the Bronx, an area, in 1924, we like to think of walkable cities or smart cities or whatever Rich Florida talks about as a new advent in thinking. But we had intact ecologies. We had the ability to walk to schools and walk to post offices and supermarkets and all of that. Segregated, but we had them. But as urban renewal and these policies begin to infiltrate, you see the shift over time and the massive destruction that occurs. I hope you don't think that this is by accident. I hope you don't think that this is just people wake up one day and they want their communities to look like this. This is, again, the perception that we've put in. And despite the infill of these areas, we still have tremendous inequity. And 2020 highlighted that when New York, and particularly my city, borough, the Bronx, was the highest impacted by COVID. And I lost 4 family members. Not because of issues of over or living together, it's because of a history that leads to issues that you have health-wise or pre-existing conditions. So again, how do we talk about health equity or spatializing health equity if we don't have the thinking that really transforms this space? This has led us to really, again, think of what does it mean to design for democracy? And part of my role at Trahan Architects, along with Trey Trahan, is really creating this third space, a nonprofit that really understands what does it mean to spatialize or what is the practice of equity, healing, and justice. What is the agency of spatial practice to address the destruction of communities and their value inflicted by policies, practices, and investments like redlining, urban renewal, and planned shrinkage? How do we heal the mental models that still, again, are with us today? How do we heal trauma? How do we promote the kind of architecture necessary to scale our humanity? Again, this framework embodies a pedagogy necessary, a process, and that translates into spatial practice. And we like to think that it's a Herculean lift, that, oh, these systems are too big, we can't transform them. What can we do as architects? Well, we do a lot as architects already. How do we begin to change the way we think through, again, what we learn? I'm going to share projects that really emphasize what does it mean to spatialize these concepts. So for this project, I was approached by a developer in the height of the 2020 storm to say, how do I become intentional about racial equity? What is it that I can do with my work that really translates this into space? And what we did was we created an internal process and pedagogical understanding of the site itself. We took the developer through a history. This is the Weeksville community in Brooklyn. And as a developer who was creating a project in this space, had no clue or concept that it was a predominantly African-American community at one point. That African-Americans actually owned a lot of the land in the area before this public housing was put there. It's easy to scapegoat and say, how do we solve the problems of Black and brown people within public housing, instead of understanding what the history was in this area. And this curated history not only showed land ownership, but it showed community. It showed interaction. It showed storefronts, this Jane Jacobs-esque type of navigation. It showed the ability to sit in shops. It showed, again, this intact ecology that really provided and created spaces of engagement and interaction. And of course, we know, again, that translation of policies, practices, and investments. We know urban renewal and slum clearance were used to justify the destruction of communities. And all of that was swept away and replaced with this with this NYCHA public housing site. And of course, over the years, NYCHA becomes stigmatized. The first thing we assault in funding. And he asked, well, what do we do? One of the things we said is that we have to recirculate the pathways. We have to get, all of us in this room should want to cross the street and not look at it as it's something over there, that it's not our business, it's not something we need to interact with. And one of the programs that he created, or they were interested in doing, was a food pantry. And that was where we chose to sort of focus on our intervention. We know that food pantries and soup kitchens reinforce spectacle within the built environment. They keep othering people. They keep looking at poverty as a bad thing, or that, oh, these poor people over here, not understanding that this was predicated on a deeper history. So how do we deal with issues of food apartheid and food access within the built environment? And what we encouraged them to do was, instead of creating another food pantry or soup kitchen, why don't you use it as a place to integrate and create a food cafe? A food cafe that would drive local economic development by creating jobs of who owns it, but also creates a forgotten place of communal connection. How people can come together around food. None of us here need to know who's paying and who isn't paying. But we begin to destigmatize and remove spectacle around food. We begin to connect people, to remove boundaries and circulate through spaces that we normally would not cross the street and go to. So if Julio and I are there eating, who needs to know why we're there eating? The point is that we're eating and we're having conversation and we're seeing difference. And the developer was so blown away, which goes back to pedagogy. He said, no one ever approached a project like this with us. No one ever said that this thinking reinforces these stigmas within the built environment. How do we change the way we think? How do we change? And it takes conversation. It takes a willingness. And again, this wasn't even for an actual built project. This was just for an RFP submission. But he was so moved, the team was so moved by this, that it said this is what should dictate all of our work. And as a spatial practitioner, did I have to bring that up to them? Did I have to? No, I didn't have to. It's a choice that I made in my agency as a spatial practitioner to say, how do we use projects? This isn't a Herculean lift. This isn't that I have to topple a system tomorrow. It brings back the intrinsic and constructive values of things found in democracy, like dignity, equity, inclusion. It really lays that groundwork for what we want to see in the built environment, so that if we're walking down the street, we have a cognitive understanding that something else is possible, that something else is different, rather than the same old traditional approaches of how we design. And it took that tweaking of 4 months to get this into an RFP, to something that can be activated. So don't ever underestimate what you can do with projects as profound as this. So we took the typology of Stuyvesant Town, Cooper's Village. I don't know if any of you are familiar, but look it up. And why is that typology celebrated on ground floors that bring interaction in communal spaces? And why is it at NYCHA wasn't? And we said that it's the same typology. Why don't we infuse this into these spaces? What is it that needs to shift? And they admitted our ignorance. The elitism of design to want to whirl pen or red pen and say this should be this. It's putting humanness back into spatial practice. Another project that I've been working on for 7 years is in Trenton, New Jersey. And it's the Coalport area, which was one of the major industrial sites in Trenton. Trenton was one of the leading manufacturers of porcelain and pottery and beyond that really revolutionized plumbing and all of the components within the house and plates and things of that nature. It was a manufacturer to the world. And in this area, what started out as a 2-acre parcel of land by others who weren't from the community, speaking about food justice or food, quote unquote, desert, and it's the perforated line. What started out as a 2-acre parcel of land really led into a bigger opportunity where we begin to look at the whole ecosystem where this 2-acre parcel resides or lives in. And over time, Coalport, like every other community across this country, was, again, these intact ecosystems that transition during the suburbanization of America to Black communities that then get slum cleared, and you can see the void there, and then nothing gets filled in that really touches upon what we say as an intact ecology. So given this history, again, we started with pedagogy within the built environment. And what we talked about was the ability to we did informal exchanges around the community. We created this contextualization that I was sharing that normally isn't planned or part of planning processes. We invited community, we popped up in libraries, on vacant storefronts, we did surveying, and that went from 5 people joining to over 200 people participating in these conversations. And people feeling activated that you weren't telling them what to do with their community, but making them part of this concept of spatial practice. That they too themselves saw themselves as a spatial practitioner. That they too saw themselves as someone that can have agency to change their built environment. And I think what was really profound was that when people heard this history of context, many drew back to when it was called Goosetown and Coalport and found that their narratives, their place was respected. That we didn't start history from that point of where we were asked to come in to look at this 2-acre parcel. That their agency and knowledge was embraced and that they were the leaders of this project versus us. And then it translated again into process, visioning, based on this context of the why. Why are we doing this? Why is it about a 2-acre farm? Well, no, it wasn't just about a 2-acre farm. There were many issues here: enormous trauma, enormous violence, enormous health disparities, the soil contamination from all the industry that was in this area, the polluted water, the lack of spaces that were communal, the lack of green spaces. The list went on and on and on. And the process, the contextualization led to the process of what can we do to respond back to these communities, to the needs of this community. And that led to modeling, that led to, again, interactive spaces, and it really brought more and more people out. And people started to have something called hope. Again, how do we reverse these spatialized psychologies of inequity? How do we give agency at that table of different people, not just put a Post-it on the wall and say, this is what I'd like to see in my community, or that community engagement is just a checkbox? It really began to transform the potentiality of what can happen in this space. And then how did it translate into spatial practice? So what you saw was that it was a 2-acre farm, and that conversation led into, well, how do we actually look at all the abandoned and vacant properties here and create something called a community land trust that really looks at how we take land off of speculative markets and begin to build a portfolio that brings equity back into a community and allows for creative healing interventions to happen on those sites and parcels versus what we traditionally do on these parcels. That again commodify or move people out of communities. And then that led into, well, there's a lot of issues of no food access. You have all the state employees that come into Trenton, and there are very limited restaurants to tap into that economy. So what we created with the community was this concept of a food truck. How do we create a food truck cooperative that can go into those spaces, that drives economy, that translates into redefining spatial understanding? And how do we tap in to the talent of that community? Rather than just say, okay, we'll just do another soup kitchen, or we'll create a farm with CSA shares, and we'll put a nice little shed on top of it, and everybody can come and have fun. And that's not really changing any of those systems. This looked at the ecology where this project was going to live in and activated, again, the agency of spatial practice to really create more substantial and robust transformation to, again, these historical legacies that really pervade in today's inequity. This becomes critical when we understand what is it that we want to see, going back to Julio's question. What does justice mean? What does equity mean? And how do we, when we walk down the street, it speaks to us and comes alive? How are we reminded that what scales above all of these socio-spatial complexities is our humanity? That if we can't become in tune with that, and we see people as other, as something to solve or fix, how we again reinforce dehumanization. This allows us again to create the commonality and the bonds that we want to see. And projects like these take a lot of time, but we're not going anywhere. And if we want to see something different, that's the time it's going to take. And the neuroscience of space is real. And if we can't feel that, if we can't connect to that, if we can't understand that we're all paying the price for these deeper histories, we're going to continue to repeat them. The ignorance is going to continue to perpetuate itself. So when we look at our projects, and I apologize for the small diagram, but a lot of our work starts with, what are the macro systems? What are the things that we're trying to change? And how it's what we cover. How did eugenics, how did the forceful appropriation of lands from First Nations people create a lot of the divided natures that we're seeing? What are the systemic challenges produced from, again, the perceptions, the mental models, the power connections, the power dynamics, the connections and networks, and the policies, practices, and investments? What systems were influenced and what was created? And we know that those systemic challenges have a direct correlation to the determinants of health. And the determinants of health are a growing marker, an indicator that many people are beginning to use around what is it that we're producing and how is it responding to the social determinants of health. And if we know that the determinants of health are impacted by these systemic challenges, what comes out of that? What is the day-to-day experiences of inequity? And that's our process of contextualization. So that when we go above the ground, we begin to look at, what does reframing, redesigning, and reinvesting mean? How does what we do, whether it's a real estate investment trust, whether it's a community land trust, whatever it is that we're doing from this point of pedagogy, process, and spatial practice, how is our intervention tracing back down to the root? How are we actually producing systemic change? And it's a good test and marker for a lot of the interventions and processes that we do. Again, this isn't about shaming or blaming people. What you're seeing here is very hard work that needs to be incorporated more and more in not only the space of academia, but how do you do it out in the world? This is not to make anyone feel bad. It's the reality of a history. And if this history isn't atoned for, and we don't understand why it's translated into spatial practice now, and how we continue to design for inequities, we're going to see 2020 happen in 2022, 2023. It's just going to continue. We need to begin to heal the social fabric of our community. And I do believe that as architects and planners and those of us in spatial practice with the different hats have an agency to do so. We owe it as stewards to democracy to incorporate what we can do to really ensure that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness means for everyone. And if that isn't something that gets you riled up and ready to go to do this work, I don't know what will, because it's what holds our hope steady. It's what we believe in. So when you're dispelled into this world and you're sitting at tables where people promote these myths of othering, of dehumanization, how do you say, actually, that's not the story? How do you say we can do this differently? How do you already have models to point back to? This is what this work is about. This is how we begin to undo these spatialized psychologies of inequity. Thank you.
Thank you, April. Thank you very much. I think we could open for questions. Is that okay to take some questions? Yeah.
Sure.
We just walk around with the microphone. So, and if you have questions in the audience, so if you people in the audience that is in Zoom, just let us know. Just raise your hand, and I'll let you in. So yes, Anna, you have one.
Hi, April.
Hi.
Wonderful and very powerful talk. Last semester, I taught a course, and the course was called Urban Poverty and Spatial Imagination.
Mm.
And one of the students, I don't know if he's here, he wrote a paper on certain areas in Washington, D.C., where we can still see lingering effects of redlining and grinding poverty and despair, etc., etc. One thing he noticed and he talked about is that we see food desert, but a high frequency of liquor stores.
Right.
This, I saw this, but he explored this as a kind of a research topic and so on. It kept me thinking a lot. I was wondering if you could unpack this rather paradoxical condition. Food desert, there's no supermarkets,
Right.
but there's a high frequency of liquor stores. How did it begin? Does it have any racial histories or some kind of design element behind this paradoxical condition? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I use the word food desert loosely, and I should have done quotations, because it's not food deserts. This is food apartheid, right? This is intentionally destroying areas that had supermarkets, that had healthy access to food. This is how it's connected or correlated, again, to these spatialized psychologies, right? The investment doesn't come in to put the healthy supermarket. Whole Foods does a whole production around if they're going to open a store in an area until it reaches a certain status, right? We see that in Harlem. Harlem had to be completely gentrified in order for Whole Foods to come in, right? But the correlation with liquor stores and this concept of food access or food apartheid, because even in these places that we think are food deserts, they have all the unhealthy food. They have all the fast foods with the places that have the highest obesity. It goes back again to this concept of investment, right? So it's not just redlining maps, it's this understanding what we're going to put in an area and what we deem to be valuable in an area, right? So liquor stores, what is it numbing? It's numbing a trauma-induced environment. We're not opening mental health clinics that radically transform and heal. We're opening places for people to self-medicate, but also it's a predatorial practice, right? We open up because that's what people are going to spend their money on. So there is a direct correlation in this unraveling of a social fabric and what gets replaced in these areas as again, exploitative extraction of dollars in an area. So it's a mentality, of course, that is not only with redlining, but it's also, again, a deeper history of what we deem to be worthy and valuable within communities. What we want to invest in, right? And just one more thing. There are people that are starting supermarkets. I can't remember the actor from The Wire. I don't know. He started supermarkets in Louisiana. Look him up. But it's this intentionality of someone saying, I'm going to design something that's going to benefit the community. And there's another case study called the People's Community Market out in Oakland, where they took social impact investment, and they actually opened a Whole Foods type supermarket because of the very reasons you're saying. Where can I spend my dollar that is actually going to bring a residual return on investment of health and all the other things that supermarkets bring to a community? And they opened it, and it's owned by the community, and it has an exponential impact. So there's opportunities to bring things when the investment the people choose to do that investment. And that's the pedagogy, the teaching, that we don't have to do this, but we choose to do this.
Question? Yes.
Thank you. That was a very, very deep and informative session. Just a few weeks back, there was a lot of violence, gun violence in DC, and it actually ended up in the neighborhood where I've lived for many years, but not very recent. And I'm living in it happened right in a historic school that's outside a historic school that's turned into condominiums, but right across there's an affordable housing community, a historic community, and over the 18 years I haven't seen any change. And I overheard my sister, who owns property there in the condominium, talking to the community and the police on Zoom, because she's currently based in Boston. And I was trying to understand, why this community hasn't come up. There's national parks that's come up, the baseball park, and then the United Stadium where the soccer's played. So my question is really, I'm really amazed by the work that you're doing and how you're educating the developers, because my sister's a developer and a planner. But how do we get someone like you involved? Is it the community that has to bring in? Because I don't want, because she educated me long ago that these people are not the other, just because they're affordable housing, they have a very, I understood kind of what's kind of happening, why they're in that condition, but how do we, get someone like you involved in, a project like this, get the community to be open? Can you perhaps shed some light on this?
Thank you for your question. I think it's really interesting that there's this groundswell, because it's not just me. There are many people here in DC that are doing this work, and I'm happy to connect you to that effort. I think there's a real commitment around deconstructing these myths and these narratives that were built over time. And again, I sit across from people that will celebrate me, shake my hand, and then say, you're so articulate. Am I not supposed to be articulate? There's something deep-seated. I'm not a scientist, a scientist, and I love to have conversations with neuroscientists because you're trying to understand how we continue to inform or impose these brandings, these, if a killing happens, right, for example, in Trenton it happens as well, right? We start the conversation as to that there's something wrong with the people. We don't look at the trauma-induced environments that now for generations have surrounded a community. We've starved communities of resources and the right culturally competent resources. I see the work of brilliant women in the community that are going in and offering cultural competency because either they lived through it or they understand it very differently. And I think those are key components with people that I can connect you with doing the work in DC. And another aspect of it is that when you look at what gets funded, this work is really hard. It doesn't get funded as much as other people's work that produces zero value gets funded. And I think that when we talk about what is our agency, maybe it's when you're in that dinner conversation with those who are doing the funding. You say, there's work that you should be shifting and supporting that really is about this healing and equity and spatial justice, because we'll throw that out, but none of us have a clue, right, on how to actually manifest it. And that's the hard work. It's easy to give sound bites, but the hard work is to actually go through. Trenton, 7 years doing this work because it matters and it's going to set a precedent. It's very important for us to put the pedagogy and the process out there that shifts the mindset because people think of these areas as pariahs and the solution is we're going to lock them up. We're going to put them away and clean up a neighborhood. They did this in Harlem. And that really isn't solving anything. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. It's not a linear silver bullet, one-shot answer. It's deep, deep work that people have to commit themselves to. And I think academic institutions should also be part of that transformation. The students should do that work, and they'll learn as well. So it's a to be continued conversation. And again, I'm happy to connect you with individuals.
Thank you very much for the talk. You mentioned the walkable cities that once existed and once existed as you spoke about in a segregated world. And then the whole country went through suburbanization and then the urban renewal process that we've seen the dramatic results. I wanted to ask, at this point that the walkable city is becoming kind of a buzz thing again, is it possible to now plan and design in the way that we've seen it? It feels like so long ago now, but we've seen these smaller, more dense areas. Is it possible to take those same principles that were part of a segregated world and keep really that kind of design and planning the same and now in a world where we're more enlightened, or does anything different have to happen to use those principles we've seen in the past?
Excellent question, and thank you for that. Again, you see the transformation of Washington, D.C. and what happened, right? And again, the ability to walk to shops and stores, and we need more spaces that connect us as neighbors and community. Of course, the footprint can exist, but because of economics and that thing we were talking about, intergenerational wealth, we have to begin challenging that it can't just be straight rent, or we have to embode different models. And I encourage you to look up, his name is Herman Jasser, and he was charged with creating one of the first limited equity cooperatives in New York State. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with limited equity cooperatives, but basically it allows for diversity to occur, in essence, because if you have different incomes and you can't afford these exorbitant rents. But what I think it also does that I find profound is it shifts this conversation of a renter community, which is easy for NIMBYism to happen and all these, I don't want it here, to now we're all owners, right? And if I buy something, I'm just giving a figure for $10,000, and I can't go and sell that for $2 million, right? So when we think of, again, how do we look at the systems framework, how do we incorporate these concepts or these building models that existed and have existed and done really well. There's a 12-year waiting list to get into amalgamated housing, which is the one in the Bronx. And when you look at what it's done, it's created community so that people didn't have to be forced out through rent increases, right? They were able to plant their feet. And it wasn't about commodifying my shelter. It was about me being part of this ecology. So yes, we can recreate it, but we have to understand and contend with the economics of populations that particularly are coming from a history that didn't allow, people think, oh, it's all over because we fought a war. No, it was like Jim Crow and a whole bunch of other things that happened. And it wasn't that, it's not only that those things happened, there was a collateral consequence to wealth, to the ability to have education, to the ability to get a job that impacts the ability to, bring value or take advantage of a walkable city. It's an excellent model, but if we want to create it inclusively and remove the segregation, because we're resegregating our cities now, right, with how we're developing, because who can afford them? It's not the people that were there on the front lines. So if we look at other models and incorporate that, I think there is hope on what we can do.
Any questions?
Thank you. I'm going to say that I think some of the key issues that you touched upon are really the capitalist model. So when you talk about changing the economics, a co-op or a public benefit corporation, a land trust, you're talking about radical changes that there are examples throughout the US and the world, but it's not the typical American way. So one of the principal enemies of good planning, in fact, is the profit motive, and you got to deal with that. And the other side of that is that primarily the folks who don't want to live in integrated communities are the white folks. And so you've got this major systemic issues in the US about racism, and it's primarily, as I say it, as a white guy, it's the white man's problem because the white guys don't want to live with other people, generally. And then it's the economics of people got to have profit, or if we all learn how to live in a different environment, then we might be happy with less, or find other ways to provide for each other.
I appreciate your valid points, and I think that when we look at a lot of the investment that came in, in more of the contemporary period to rebuild places like DC and sections of Baltimore or the Bronx, where I'm from, it still is federally funded, right? It's still the federal government putting the risks, taking all the risks through the subsidies, right? Low income tax housing credits, et cetera. So what we want to do is push this conversation that you are doing the same thing that we did in the New Deal, essentially, is that you're creating speculation in an area. You're using public dollars that we all pay taxes with to create this hyper-segregation all over again. And you're doing it at the expense and cost, again, of our humanity and of our democracy. And I think we have to have different conversations. It's not radical. We're doing these investments. It's the people that are, again, sitting at these positions of power, putting these investments out, that have a mindset of how they're going to fund things. So that, we're dealing with it on that front. And I think I'm coming across, I really don't like it's there, but it's how do we deconstruct the social construct of race, right? It's all made up. It's not real. You're not white, you're not black, we're human beings. It doesn't exist. We have used it as a tool to weaponize division. And you're right, it's all of us that have to say stop. I want to live in different communities and with different people. And I'm finding more and more that when people are given that agency or space, that they're not going to be attacked for their identity both ways. We find very beautiful commonality. And sometimes it takes patience for what we've been conditioned to think. And I really feel that most of us want this healing and connectivity. And sometimes we feel lost on how to make that happen. But that's also the part of spatial practice that I'm talking about. How do we have those conversations with HUD and policymakers and begin to destigmatize the propaganda that has been used to say, I don't want to live next door to you. It's so entrenched because it's like, it's like, oh, there goes the neighborhood if they see difference, right? And they use money and taxes to keep you out now. So we have work to do if we really care. Again, I care. I believe in reparations to my democracy. I am in love with my democracy. And I want to spend time trying to fix that because it's created a mess and we won't have it anymore.
So in suburban neighborhoods, how can we kind of build trust between communities? So where I'm from, there's like a big benefactor of intergenerational wealth, and then the town over is struggling. So how can we have people from more well-off communities invest and help those communities so we can get on the path of integration?
Great question, and thank you for asking it. I think a big part of it is starting a conversation. I don't know if you're familiar with Ella Baker, but they started like these study circles, and it was during the civil rights movement. And it may seem basic, but if you don't know and build solidarity by respecting a history, as I mentioned, what we did in places like Trenton, it's hard to go anywhere beyond that in the conversation. I would start with inviting people to forums like this, where people are speaking of these deeper histories. Start with a group of individuals, have conversation, look at what other people are doing, and I think encourage your studio professors here or your spaces outside. What are projects that we can look at that take on a longer trajectory, that it's not just an intervention and it's done at the end of the semester? How do we begin to build a commitment towards spatial equity? How do we spatialize democracy? And again, start with the conversations to build that trust, because everyone now is like, oh, it's highly polarized. But invite them. There's films that I'm happy to share with Julio. Decade of Fire, I don't know how many of you saw that. It's on PBS. Death by Zip Code, Segregated by Design. I would start in those spaces and build that type of trust through the different forms of pedagogy that connects people together.
One more question. More?
Boy, I'm happy I put my Sperry's on, and the memory foam is good.
I didn't see it.
Hi, thank you so much for being here today. I just have one quick question. Do you see any relationship between gentrified neighborhoods and large company chains, such as like Walmart, Target, Starbucks? Do you see any relationship between the two?
I think from an investment perspective, again, when we look at REITs, real estate investment trusts, a lot of that money, if you trace that money, it takes you down a rabbit hole. But it looks at like who's putting investment in to acquire property and real estate and then sell them or commodify them. So I think not the ones you may have mentioned, but there is definitely corporate alignment with speculation in the banks. Because if I'm putting in as an investor in a trust that just demolishes neighborhoods and builds and extrapolates, I'm not connected to a process. And back to his point, there are spaces within the social impact investment community that are growing. People are, how they're removing themselves from fossil fuel investments. It's the same type of aspect that has to happen when it comes to real estate, right? Because the country, to your point, has been built, the wealth has been built on property, right? So it was human property, it's real estate property, land, and it's chattel. And we need to begin to deconstruct those correlations. And I don't think it's just saying we're going to have a blackout and not buy. It's really understanding what are the alternatives that are happening. And there are amazing alternatives that are using impact investment to do land acquisition so that we're not gentrifying communities. But certainly a presence of Whole Foods or others creates speculation that, oh, it's coming in, we're going to get everybody to move in with money. So how do we begin to reframe that narrative and create counterpoints or interventions that are not going to allow for that speculation to continue?
Absolutely one last question.
Okay.
Thank you, Julio. Much delighted getting the last question out. When I was talking about the student who wrote the paper, he's right there. I didn't see him. He's right there. So wonderful paper. Good job, Mike.
Good job, Mike.
As you argued, discrimination, othering, all these have been instituted, as you argued, through design. Redlining is one tool, was a design tool that instituted kind of apartheid and segregation and so on. And you argued that in order to undo the damage of these kinds of social injustices, we have to unlearn design. Can you take that argument to schools, to pedagogy? Can you picture some type of courses, studios that would help unlearn the design processes?
Great question. Absolutely. Again, I think when we are given our assignments in studio, it's you have to do this intervention and these are the parameters of this intervention. And that may work for some things. But I think that academia plays a big role to undo what was done with, again, scientific racism and eugenics, where it's this propaganda that gets promoted. And how do you use studio to create the contextualization of why the intervention, not just about the intervention. Why are we doing this? What is it impacting? What is it creating? What is it healing? How is it spatializing these concepts, again, of healing, equity, and justice? So a studio that allows for that and continues momentum and looks at it very interdisciplinary, I think brings enormous value to spatial practice. And we all, I hope, read Whitney M. Young's speech, 1968 speech to the AIA, where he says to the profession, you for far too long have been complicit in creating what we have seen. And your classrooms, your studios play a huge role in beginning to unthink that and having administration that supports that, who says, if you believe in this equity, we got to do it, we got to teach it at the same time. So I really, I've taught in my courses, and again, in the consolidated time we have, we put students, we immerse them into this history. And it really shows, and they have said in their testimony, my design is different because I know this. I can't design differently if I don't know this. So how do we expose students to this information? And how does it translate into their interventions that, again, really are aimed to scale humanity?
Thank you very much.
All right.